The wind was a blade against her skin, honed on the jagged peaks of the Dragon's Tooth Mountains. It smelled of ice and ancient stone, a scent that promised nothing but endings. Below her, the Blood Moon Court was a slash of darkness, carved into the mountainside, a fortress that devoured the moonlight rather than reflecting it. This was King Darik Voss's domain, the place where souls came to be unmade. Adana R'Lin clutched the worn leather of her satchel, the phantom weight of the moon contract pressing against her ribs, a constant reminder of the price she had already agreed to pay. 7 nights. For her mother's life, a miracle of healing that had left the village shaman speechless, she had signed away her soul. Tonight was the first. The inevitable was no longer a whisper of dread in the distance. It was the granite step beneath her worn boot. The colossal gates of the fortress, forged from black iron and shadow, swung inward without a sound. No sentries hailed her, no horns announced her arrival. The silence was a living thing, a predator that coiled in the vast courtyard. 2 figures emerged from the gloom, tall and broad, clad in dark leather that seemed to drink the faint starlight. Their faces were impassive, their eyes holding the flat, cold sheen of polished river stones. They didn't speak, merely gestured for her to follow, their movements economical and unnervingly synchronized. Adina's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage of bone. She had expected guards, but these were something else entirely, jailers, specters given form. She followed them across the courtyard, her footsteps echoing in the crushing emptiness. The air grew colder, heavy with the scent of ozone, and something else, something metallic and primal that reminded her of a lightning strike on a lone pine. They passed through a series of archways that grew progressively larger, each one making her feel smaller, more insignificant. There were no tapestries on the walls, no braziers lit for warmth or welcome, only bare black stone that seemed to weep with a perpetual chill. The whispers she'd heard in her village seemed to cling to the air here, tales of a king so consumed by his curse that he could no longer feel warmth, a beast who ruled a court of ghosts. Finally, they reached a pair of doors that stood 30 feet high, carved from the heartwood of some long-dead monstrous tree. One of the guards placed a hand on the wood, and the doors groaned open, revealing the throne room. It was not a room, but a cavern. The ceiling was lost in shadow, supported by colossal pillars that looked like the fossilized bones of giants. A single throne, carved from a solid block of obsidian, sat upon a raised dais. It was empty. The only light came from a massive roaring fire in a hearth large enough to roast an ox whole. The flames cast long dancing shadows that writhed like tormented spirits. The guards stopped at the threshold. One of them pointed a single gauntleted finger toward the center of the room. Then they both turned and receded into the hallway, the great doors closing behind them, with a sound like a final judgment. Adina was alone. She stood frozen, a tiny, insignificant thing in a hall built for legends and monsters. The sheer scale of the place was meant to intimidate, to crush the will of any who entered. She forced herself to take a breath, the frigid air burning her lungs. She had not come here to be broken. She had come here to pay a debt. She walked forward, her boots silent on the flagstones. The heat from the fireplace was a physical blow after the biting cold, but it felt hollow. It warmed her skin, but did not penetrate the ice that had taken root in her bones. She stopped 20 feet from the dais, her gaze fixed on the empty throne. She would not kneel. That was the one promise she had made to herself. He could take her soul, but he would not have her submission. Time stretched, marked only by the crackle and spit of the fire. The silence deepened, pressing in on her until her ears rang. She focused on her mother's face, the way her eyes had cleared from their feverish haze, the faint color returning to her cheeks the morning after the emissaries had left. That image was her armor. It was the only thing she had left. A subtle shift in the atmosphere preceded him. The air grew heavy, thick with a pressure that made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. The scent of ozone and pine intensified, now mingled with something else, the dark, musky aroma of a predator. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to coalesce, to deepen and draw inward toward the dais. He did not walk from a hidden door or emerge from the darkness. One moment, the throne was empty. The next, he was there. King Darik Voss was larger than any man she had ever seen. He was not sitting, but lounging in the obsidian throne, one leg casually thrown over the armrest, as if the monolithic seat were a common tavern chair. He was a study in brutal contradictions. Dressed in simple black trousers and a loose-fitting tunic, his form was one of raw, condensed power. His shoulders were impossibly broad, his arms corded with muscle. His dark hair was long and untamed, falling around a face that was all harsh angles and savage beauty. A jagged scar ran from his left temple, across the bridge of his nose, and disappeared into the line of his jaw, a white seam in his sun-darkened skin. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of molten gold, and they burned with a light that was ancient and weary, and utterly terrifying. They were not human eyes. They were the eyes of the beast she had been warned about. He said nothing, simply watched her, his expression unreadable. His stillness was absolute, the coiled patience of a wolf waiting for a deer to make a fatal mistake. Adina held his gaze, her heart a frantic drum against the wall of her chest. She could feel his power washing over her, a tangible force that probed at her defenses. Searching for cracks, for fear, she gave it none. She thought of her mother's smile and held firm. Adina R'lyeh, he finally spoke. His voice was not the monstrous roar she had expected. It was a low, gravelly timbre, like stones grinding together deep within the earth. It was a voice that held the weight of centuries, and it vibrated through the floor, up through the soles of her feet. You came. It was the terms of the contract, she replied, proud that her own voice came out steady, betraying none of the tremor that racked her insides. A slow, dangerous smile touched his lips, but it did not reach his burning eyes. Most who sign my contracts send proxies, or they try to flee, they beg, they weep. He leaned forward slightly, the movement fluid and predatory. You do not. Weeping would not change the terms. His golden eyes narrowed, studying her with an unnerving intensity. No, it would not, but it is the expected response. He rose from the throne in a single silent motion. He was even taller than she had imagined, a giant of a man who dwarfed the massive throne. He descended the 3 steps of the dais and began to walk toward her, his heavy boots making no sound on the stone. He moved with a liquid grace that was utterly at odds with his size, the silent tread of a hunter. He circled her slowly, like a wolf assessing its prey. She stood her ground, her back ramrod straight, forcing herself to breathe evenly. His scent enveloped her, pine, ozone, and that primal, musky scent of wolf. It was overwhelming, intoxicating, and terrifying all at once. It spoke of wild places and blood spilled on snow. You are not what I expected, he murmured, his voice a low growl just behind her ear. She flinched, but did not turn. There is no terror in your scent, only resolve. It is a distasteful odor. I am here to fulfill my end of the bargain, Your Majesty, nothing more. He came to a stop in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. She had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. Up close, the scar on his face was a brutal testament to some long-ago battle. His eyes, those molten gold abysses, seemed to look straight through her, peeling back the layers of her composure to see the frightened girl cowering beneath. The bargain, he repeated softly, a strange, almost mocking light in his eyes. You speak of it as if it were a simple trade of goods. A soul for a life. You have no true comprehension of what you have surrendered. I saved my mother. The price is mine to pay. For a moment, something flickered in his gaze, something that wasn't curse or cruelty. It looked like surprise, or perhaps a flicker of grudging respect. It was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the cold, predatory mask. Brave words, he said, his voice dropping lower. Let us see if that bravery survives the first night. Your service is not to scrub floors or serve my meals, Adina R'lyeh. Your service is to be a witness. A chill, colder than any mountain wind, snaked down her spine. A witness to what? He didn't answer. Instead, he raised a hand. His fingers were long and calloused, his knuckles scarred. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gesture toward the fire. The moon contract is bound by ritual. Each night, a piece of what you are is transferred. It feeds the magic that healed your mother. It starves the curse that devours me. Her blood ran cold. What does that mean? It means, he said, his golden eyes locking onto hers, that for you to remain whole, you must not give anything of yourself. No fear, no pity, no hope. You must be a stone, an empty vessel. He took another step closer, his massive chest nearly brushing against her. But the curse, it is hungry, and it will try to take those things from you. Suddenly a shudder racked his enormous frame. A low growl rumbled in his chest, an involuntary sound of deep, guttural pain. He clenched his fists, the knuckles turning white. The golden light in his eyes intensified, swirling like a storm. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch and writhe, drawn toward him. "It begins," he rasped. His voice strained. "The first night, the first test." He turned away from her, stalking toward the center of the room, his body moving with a stiff, pained gait. He threw his head back, and a sound tore from his throat that was not human. A roar of agony and rage that shook the very stones of the hall. Adina stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth. This was the beast from the stories. This was the curse. Black veins began to crawl up his neck, pulsing with a sickening dark energy. His muscles bunched and writhed under his skin, his form seeming to shift and distort in the firelight. He fell to one knee, his head bowed, his breath coming in ragged, harsh pants. "Your service," he snarled, his voice thick and distorted, "is to watch, to see the beast that I am, and to offer it nothing. Your soul is the price, girl. Do not give it away piece by piece before the final dawn." He lifted his head, and his eyes were no longer molten gold. They were blazing pools of black fire, shot through with veins of red. The man was gone, and only the curse remained, staring at her with an ancient, insatiable hunger. He did not move to attack her, only knelt there, locked in a battle with the monster inside him. And his eyes pleaded with her, not for help, but for her to be strong enough to deny him. He had told her to be a stone. But as she watched the cursed king tremble on the floor, fighting a war within his own skin, a flicker of something she had sworn to suppress, a terrible, traitorous pang of pity, ignited in her chest. He felt it. His head snapped up, a snarl twisting his lips to reveal elongated canines. "No," he growled, the word a desperate command. The contract against her ribs burned with a sudden, searing heat, as if a hot coal had been pressed to her skin. She gasped, clutching her side. The king's curse was not just a spectator sport. It was a predator, and it had just taken its first bite. The night was only just beginning. The searing pain in her side vanished as abruptly as it had appeared, leaving behind a profound and unsettling cold. It was not the chill of the stone hall, but an internal emptiness, a hollow ache deep in her marrow where something vital had been scooped out. Adina watched as the black fire in King Darik's eyes receded, drawn back like a tide, leaving the molten gold in its wake. The change was just as violent as the onset. The tension in his massive frame snapped, and he sagged, catching himself on one hand against the floor. A shudder of pure exhaustion racked his body. He remained on one knee for a long moment, his head bowed, his ragged breaths echoing in the cavernous silence. When he finally looked up at her, the mask of the fearsome Alpha King was back in place, but she could see the cracks. There was a faint tremor in his hands, a sheen of sweat on his brow. His golden eyes were hard, but they held a weariness that went beyond physical exertion. It was the weariness of ages. "You felt pity, Claude," he stated, his voice a low, rough rasp. It was not an accusation, but a flat declaration of failure. Her failure, his. "I saw a man in pain," she countered, her voice quiet but firm. She refused to be shamed for a moment of empathy. He pushed himself to his feet with a groan of protesting muscle. The sheer power he had exuded earlier was diminished, banked like the embers of a dying fire. "There is no man here for you to pity. There is only the curse and the vessel it inhabits. You gave it a foothold, you fed it." He gestured to her side, where the phantom cold still lingered. "That piece you lost? It will not grow back. 6 more nights, 6 more pieces. If you are not careful, there will be nothing left of you for the contract to claim at the end." His words were a cold slap, meant to shock her back into the role he needed her to play. The unfeeling witness. He stalked back to the obsidian throne and slumped into it, the very picture of a predator licking its wounds. The aura of invincibility he had projected upon his arrival was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous. Vulnerability. "Go," he commanded, waving a dismissive hand. "The trial is over for tonight." As if summoned by his will, one of the silent guards materialized from the shadows near the great doors. He stood motionless, waiting for her. Adana hesitated. Her gaze locked on the king. She saw the mind-tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers curled into a fist on the armrest of his throne. He was fighting to maintain control, to not show the cost of the night's battle. Turning her back on him felt like abandoning a wounded animal, a dangerous and unpredictable one. But she had no choice. She gave a stiff, formal nod that was more an acknowledgement than a bow, and turned to follow the guard. The journey through the castle was as silent and oppressive as before. Her guide led her through a labyrinth of corridors, up winding staircases, and across cavernous, empty halls. The entire fortress felt dead, a beautiful, monstrous corpse. There were no servants, no courtiers, no signs of life beyond the three of them. The air was still and frigid, disturbed only by their passage. She could feel the weight of centuries of silence pressing down on her. How could anyone, even a cursed king, live in such profound isolation? The thought came unbidden, and with it, another dangerous flicker of sympathy. She crushed it instantly, the memory of that searing pain a potent deterrent. Finally, the guard stopped before a heavy, iron-strapped wooden door. He pushed it open and gestured for her to enter. He did not cross the threshold. As she stepped inside, he pulled the door shut behind her, the heavy thud of the latch echoing down the empty hallway, sealing her in. The room was surprisingly grand. A massive four-poster bed draped in dark velvet dominated the space. A fire was already crackling in a stone hearth, its light dancing across plush rugs and ornately carved furniture. It was a chamber fit for a queen, yet it felt as lifeless as the rest of the castle. There was no clutter, no personal touches, no scent but that of cold stone and wood smoke. A pitcher of water and a single cup sat on a small table, alongside a plate with a hunk of bread and some hard cheese. Subsistence, not comfort. Adana walked to the fire, holding her hands out to the flames. The warmth was real, unlike the hollow heat in the throne room. Yet it couldn't touch the chill that had settled deep inside her. She pressed a hand to her side, over the spot where the contract had burned. The flesh was cool to the touch. The emptiness was still there, a tiny void in the fabric of her being. He was right. A piece of her was gone. Her eyes drifted around the room, landing on a tall, freestanding mirror in the corner. It was an exquisite piece, its silver frame wrought into the shape of coiling vines and thorns. Driven by a morbid curiosity, she walked toward it. She needed to see if the loss was visible, if she looked any different. Her reflection stared back at her, pale and wide-eyed in the flickering firelight. Her brown hair was slightly disheveled from the wind, her simple woolen dress rumpled from her journey. She looked like herself, frightened, exhausted, but whole. She leaned closer, searching her own eyes for any sign of change. They were still the same familiar shade of green, like moss after a rain. She saw the fear in them, but also the stubborn resolve that had carried her this far. She let out a slow breath of relief. It was an internal wound then, unseen. She turned away, but a flicker of movement in the glass caught her eye. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She whipped her head back to the mirror. Her reflection stood perfectly still, mimicking her own startled posture. It must have been a trick of the firelight, a dancing shadow. She forced herself to relax, her pulse thundering in her ears. Slowly, cautiously, she looked back into the reflection's eyes. And then she saw it. For the briefest of instants, the green of her reflected eyes seemed to dim, clouded by a film of gray, like ice forming over a pond. At the same time, the corner of the reflection's mouth tilted upwards, in a faint, knowing smirk. It was a cold, cruel expression she had never made in her life. Adana gasped and stumbled back, her hand flying to her own mouth. Her lips were set in a firm, horrified line. She looked back at the mirror. The smirk was gone. The eyes were her own again, but the image was burned into her mind. It wasn't just a trick of the light. She had seen it. The emptiness inside her wasn't empty at all. Something else was looking out through her eyes. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She backed away from the mirror until her legs hit the edge of the bed and she collapsed onto the mattress. She stared at the silvered glass, her mind racing. The king had said the curse would try to take things from her, but he hadn't said what would be left in their place. This was worse than simply having her soul taken. This was a slow, creeping replacement. An invasion. The door to her chamber creaked open. Adina screamed, scrambling backward on the bed, her eyes wide with terror. King Darek stood on the threshold, his massive frame filling the doorway. He had changed from his simple tunic into a fresh one, and his hair was damp, as if he'd just doused his head in cold water. His golden eyes swept the room, taking in her panicked state, her position on the bed, and her terrified gaze fixed on the corner of the room. He followed her line of sight to the ornate mirror. His expression hardened. He said nothing, simply stepped inside and closed the door softly behind him. The sound, so much quieter than the guard's final thud, was somehow more menacing. He walked toward the mirror, his silent, predatory grace having returned. He stood before it, his back to her, and stared at his own reflection. "What did you see?" he asked, his voice low and devoid of emotion. My reflection," Adina stammered, her voice trembling. It wasn't me." He remained silent for a long moment, his broad shoulders tense. "The castle is old," he said finally, still not turning around. "And it is an extension of me, of my curse. It remembers things, it reflects things. Sometimes it shows what is, sometimes what was, and sometimes what could be." "It smiled," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "It looked cruel." At that he turned. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes burned with an intensity that pinned her to the spot. "You fed the curse your pity. It left a vacuum. The castle abhors a vacuum. It will try to fill you with its own echoes. Cruelty, despair, resignation. These walls are saturated with them." He took a step toward her, and then another. He stopped at the foot of the bed, a dark, towering mountain of a man. She could feel the heat of him from across the room, could smell the scent of pine and the cold, clean scent of night. "You have 6 nights left," he said, his voice a low growl. "You cannot afford to lose yourself before the debt is paid. Your weakness tonight has endangered us both." "Endangered you?" she scoffed, a spark of her earlier defiance returning, fueled by her terror. "How does my soul being eaten away piece by piece endanger you?" His eyes narrowed. "The magic of the contract is a delicate balance. Your soul is the anchor that holds my curse at bay while the ritual works. A pure, whole soul. If your soul becomes tainted, corrupted by the echoes of this place before the 7th night, the anchor will fail. The curse will break free, and it will consume what is left of me. And then it will come for you and everyone else on this mountain. Your mother's miracle will be undone in a tide of blood." The sheer gravity of his words stole her breath. This wasn't just about her. Her failure wouldn't just cost her own soul. It could unleash a monster upon the world and reverse the one good thing she had managed to achieve. The weight of that responsibility was crushing. He saw the understanding, the dawning horror on her face. He gave a slow, grim nod. "So you see, your pity is a luxury none of us can afford. From now on, you will be a stone. You will feel nothing. You will give nothing. You will watch, and you will endure." He held her gaze for a heartbeat longer, a silent command passing between them. Then, he turned to leave. His hand was on the latch of the door when her voice, small but clear in the quiet room, stopped him. "Was it your choice?" He froze, his back rigid. He did not turn. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken history. The fire crackled in the hearth, the only sound in the world. "To bear this curse," she clarified, her voice gaining strength. "Was it ever your choice?" He remained motionless for so long she thought he would not answer. She thought he would simply open the door and leave her alone with the whispering glass and the terrifying weight of his revelation. Then very slowly, he turned his head, just enough to look at her over his shoulder. The firelight caught the harsh planes of his face, illuminating the jagged line of his scar. The mask was gone. In his molten gold eyes, she saw not a king, not a beast, but a man trapped in a cage of his own flesh, haunted by a past she couldn't begin to comprehend. "A promise," he said, his voice so low it was almost a whisper, raw with a pain that dwarfed anything she had witnessed in the throne room. is always a choice. And then he was gone, pulling the door shut behind him, leaving her alone in the silent, waiting dark. The cold was the first thing she felt upon waking. It was not the ambient chill of the stone room, which the banked fire in the hearth held at bay. This was the other cold, the void inside her, a small, perfect sphere of nothingness just beneath her ribs. It was a constant, phantom pressure, a reminder of her failure, of the piece of pity she had foolishly given away. Sleep had offered no respite, her dreams filled with visions of a woman in a mirror whose green eyes slowly iced over, whose lips curled into a smile that did not belong to her. Adina sat up, the velvet coverlet pooling in her lap. Her gaze went immediately to the ornate mirror in the corner. It stood silent and gleaming in the thin morning light that filtered through a high, narrow window. It looked innocent, a mere object of silver and glass, but she knew it was a liar. It was a predator, waiting to show her the monster she could become. He had told her to be a stone. The words echoed in her mind. A grim mantra. How did one become a stone? Did you simply refuse to feel? Or did you have to hollow yourself out first, leaving nothing inside to be touched? She thought of her mother, of the warmth in her hands, the love in her eyes, everything that made Adina who she was. Her empathy, her compassion, was now a liability, a weapon the curse could use against her. To survive the next 6 nights, she had to kill the best parts of herself. She forced herself out of bed. The plate of bread and cheese was untouched from the night before. She broke off a piece of the stale bread, her stomach twisting, and made herself chew and swallow. She would not starve. She would not grow weak. She would give this place nothing more than her presence. With a deep, fortifying breath, she walked to the mirror. She had to know. She had to face it. Her reflection appeared, a pale, tired-looking girl with shadows under her eyes. She stared into the reflected green depths, searching for the icy gray film, for the cruel smirk. There was nothing, only her own frightened face. But the absence of the apparition was somehow more terrifying. It meant the thing she had seen wasn't in the glass. It was inside her, waiting. A quiet knock came at the door, not the heavy final sound of the latch, but a simple rap of knuckles on wood. She tensed, expecting one of the silent guards. The door opened, and a woman stood there. She was old, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her silver hair pulled into a tight, severe bun. She wore a simple gray dress, and in her hands she carried a folded set of clean clothes. She didn't speak, her eyes downcast, and simply stepped inside, placed the clothes on the foot of the bed, and turned to leave. "Wait," Adina called out, her voice raspy. The old woman paused, her hand on the door, but did not turn. "Who are you? Are there others here?" Adina asked. A desperate need for a human connection, however small, rising in her. The woman remained silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was a dry, rustling whisper, as if it hadn't been used in years. "There are only those who serve the castle. Be a good girl, be quiet, survive your 7 nights. Do not look for answers in this place. There are only echoes." And then she was gone, closing the door softly behind her. The woman's warning settled over Adina like a shroud. Do not look for answers. But how could she not? She was a prisoner in a contract she didn't fully understand, tied to a cursed king whose fate was now inexplicably linked to her own. To be a stone, she needed a foundation of knowledge. To remain impassive, she had to understand what she was facing. Ignorance was a breeding ground for fear, and fear, she suspected, was just as dangerous as pity. She dressed in the clothes the woman had brought, a simple dark blue woolen gown, practical and warm. Then, steeling her resolve, she opened her chamber door and stepped into the empty hall. No guard was present. The castle was as silent and still as a tomb. She chose a direction at random and began to walk. She would not be a passive victim waiting in a gilded cage for the nightly trial. If this castle was an extension of the king and his curse, then she would learn its secrets. She walked for what felt like an hour, her soft boots making little sound on the endless stone floors. She passed grand archways that led into empty ballrooms, their floors thick with dust. She saw galleries of paintings where all the faces had been slashed or burned from the canvases, leaving only faceless figures in elegant clothes. The entire fortress was a monument to loss, a place where history had been violently erased. Finally, she came to a set of double doors carved with images of wolves and ancient trees. Hesitantly, she pushed one open. It swung inward on silent, well-oiled hinges, revealing a library. But it was more than a library. It was a cathedral of forgotten words. Shelves stretched up 2 stories high, disappearing into the shadowed ceiling, crammed with thousands of leather-bound books. A narrow gallery with a wrought iron railing circled the upper level. In the center of the room, a massive oak table was surrounded by proud high-backed chairs, all of it covered in a fine layer of dust. The air smelled of old paper, cracked leather, and time itself. The only sign of recent use was a cleared space at one end of the table, where a single enormous tome lay open. This was it, a place of answers. She walked toward the table, her fingers trailing through the dust on its surface. The open book was a history, its pages filled with elegant, handwritten script and intricate illustrations of constellations and royal lineages. She saw the name Voss repeated down the page, a dynasty stretching back 1,000 years. "I had hoped you would have the sense to remain in your room." The voice came from the shadows of the upper gallery. Adina gasped and spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs. King Darek stood leaning against the iron railing, looking down at her. He was dressed as he had been the night before, in dark, simple clothes that did nothing to hide the raw power of his form. He hadn't made a sound. He had been watching her. "Your servant gave no orders for me to stay," Adina replied, lifting her chin. Her fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but she would not show it. She would be a stone. He descended a spiral staircase in the corner, his movements silent and fluid. "Elspeth is a servant of the castle, not of me. And she gave you good advice, I'm sure. Advice you have chosen to ignore." He came to a stop on the other side of the long table, his golden eyes boring into her. "What do you hope to find here? A loophole in your contract? A history of my family's misfortunes? There is nothing here for you but dust and sorrow." "I want to understand what I'm facing," she said, her voice steady. "You demand I feel nothing, but you leave me in ignorance. Fear grows in the dark. I will not be afraid." A flicker of something, surprise perhaps, crossed his features before being suppressed. "A commendable sentiment," he said, his voice laced with a cold irony. "But misplaced. Understanding the nature of the cage does not help the bird escape. It only makes it more aware of the bars." "His promise," she said, the words from the previous night returning to her. "You said it was a choice. A promise to whom? What did you do?" His face hardened into a mask of cold fury. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "You are here to be a witness, not an inquisitor. My past is my own. It is not part of your service." "It is when your past is what's trying to unmake my soul," she retorted, her voice rising. The stone facade was cracking already. She took a breath, forcing herself into a semblance of calm. "I will not be a pawn in a game where I don't even know the rules." "The rules are simple," he growled, placing his hands flat on the table and leaning forward, his presence suddenly overwhelming. "You will survive. You will keep your soul intact. You will be the anchor. Anything else is a distraction that will get us both killed." She held his gaze, refusing to back down. They stood in silence for a long moment, a king and a commoner, locked in a battle of wills over a dusty table of forgotten history. His anger was a palpable thing, a predator straining at a leash. But beneath it, she felt something else, a deep, profound defensiveness. He wasn't just guarding his secrets. He was guarding a wound. Deciding a direct confrontation was fruitless, she changed tactics. She turned her attention to the shelves. "Fine, I will read of other things. Surely not every book in this library is about your tragic history." She walked to the nearest shelf, running her fingers along the spines. The titles were in an older dialect, but she could make out words about herb lore, astronomy, architecture. Her fingers stopped on a thick, plain volume with no title. Curious, she tried to pull it from the tightly packed shelf. It was wedged in tight. She gripped it with both hands and pulled harder. It came loose with a sudden lurch, overbalancing her. She stumbled backward with a startled cry, the heavy book slipping from her grasp. She flailed, her feet tangling, and knew she was going to fall hard against the stone floor, but the impact never came. In a blur of motion too fast for her eyes to properly track, Darek was there. He moved from the other side of the table to behind her in a single, silent instant. One powerful arm wrapped around her waist, catching her and pulling her back against a chest that was as hard and unyielding as a wall of rock. His other hand shot out and snatched the heavy book from the air an inch before it would have shattered on the floor. The world stopped. Adina was flush against him, her back pressed into the solid heat of his body. The air was driven from her lungs, partly from the fall, mostly from the shock of his touch. His arm was an iron band around her, holding her effortlessly. She could feel the hard contours of his muscles through her dress, the steady, slow beat of his heart against her shoulder blades. He was overwhelmingly solid, real, and hot. An incredible furnace-like heat radiated from him, sinking through her clothes and warming her skin in a way no fire could. His scent enveloped her, a dizzying mix of sharp pine, cold mountain air, and the electric tang of ozone. It was the scent of the wilderness, of power and freedom and danger. Her mind went blank, all thoughts of curses and contracts dissolving in a purely physical, primal awareness of the man holding her. He held her for a second longer than was necessary, his head bent slightly, his breath stirring the hair at her temple. And in that moment, she smelled something else. Beneath the pine and the storm, beneath the scent of the beast, there was another note. It was faint, elusive, almost undetectable. It was the scent of old grief, of sorrow so profound it had sunk into his very being. It smelled like dust from a sealed room, like unshed tears and a promise broken long ago. It was the scent of a lie. The stoic mask, the cold anger, the monstrous persona, all of it was a lie. A carefully constructed wall to hide a heart that was not empty, but broken. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. He was not a monster pretending to be a man. He was a man, desperately, furiously, pretending to be a monster. He must have felt the shift in her, the sudden, piercing understanding. He stiffened and abruptly set her on her feet, stepping back as if burned. He shoved the book back onto the shelf with unnecessary force. His golden eyes, when they met hers, were blazing with a raw, panicked fury. "Do not," he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl that vibrated through the floor, "ever touch my things again." But she knew his anger wasn't about the book. It was about her, about what she had just seen, what she had just smelled. She had, for one brief, unguarded moment, scented his soul, and it was destroying him. He fled. There was no other word for it. The Alpha King of the Blood Moon Court, the beast of the mountain, turned and stalked out of the library with the haste of a man escaping a fire. He didn't look back. The great wooden doors swung shut behind him, leaving Adina standing in a cloud of dust motes, dancing in the slivers of morning light. The silence he left in his wake was heavier than before, filled with the echo of his panic and the ghost of his touch. Adina's heart was a wild, frantic thing, a hummingbird trapped in her chest. She raised a trembling hand to her waist, to the place where his arm had held her. The fabric of her dress was still warm. Her skin tingled with the memory of his heat. A deep, pervasive warmth that had nothing to do with curses, and everything to do with the living, breathing man beneath. The scent of a lie. The thought circled in her mind. A revelation that changed everything. She had been so focused on being a stone, on building her own walls, that she hadn't considered the architecture of his. He had presented himself as a monster, a vessel for a curse, a being devoid of emotion. But what she had sensed in that fleeting moment of contact was the complete opposite. He was a storm of feeling, walled up behind a dam of self-control so immense it was a miracle it hadn't already shattered. The curse wasn't devouring an empty man. It was feeding on a soul drowning in grief. The second night was coming. The knowledge was a cold stone in her stomach. Tonight, when the curse rose, she would not be seeing a monster. She would be seeing a man in a cage, rattling the bars from the inside. How was she supposed to remain a stone now? How could she watch that agony and not feel pity, knowing the truth of it? Her own survival depended on her indifference, but her discovery had made indifference impossible. His vulnerability was now her greatest weakness. She spent the rest of the day in the library, not reading, but thinking. She paced the dusty floors, the scent of old paper a soothing balm to her frayed nerves. She didn't dare touch another book. Instead, she tried to piece together the fragments she had. A promise, a deep, abiding sorrow, a self-imposed monstrosity. It painted a picture of a king who had perhaps taken on the curse willingly, as payment for some terrible mistake. A king who believed he deserved his suffering. As dusk began to bleed through the high windows, staining the air purple and gray, Elspeth, the old servant, appeared with a tray. She placed it on the table without a word, more bread, cheese, and a sliced apple this time. A small concession to luxury. Adena wasn't hungry, but she ate, forcing the food down. She would need her strength. "The king awaits you in the throne room," Elspeth whispered, her voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. Her eyes, dark and ancient, met Adena's for a brief, startling moment. They held a flicker of something that looked like warning, or maybe even sympathy. Then she was gone, a ghost melting back into the castle's shadows. Adena's walk to the throne room was a slow march toward a predetermined failure. The halls seemed darker tonight, the shadows longer and more menacing. Every step echoed with the king's final, desperate command from the previous night, "Be a stone." She repeated the words to herself, trying to make them true, trying to rebuild the wall of indifference she had so carefully constructed. She found him exactly as she had the first night, lounging in the obsidian throne, a figure of coiled stillness before the roaring fire. But tonight, she saw him differently. She saw the tension in his broad shoulders, the rigid set of his jaw. She saw the way his fingers gripped the armrest, his knuckles white. He wasn't relaxed, he was braced for impact. He was waiting for the pain to begin. He watched her approach, his golden eyes unreadable, but she felt the weight of his gaze as a physical force. It wasn't just predatory assessment tonight, it was a desperate, unspoken plea. "Don't see me, see the monster." She stopped at the designated spot, 20 feet from the dais, and folded her hands in front of her, trying to look as impassive as possible. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. "You returned to your room?" he asked. His voice a low rumble. "Yes, Your Majesty," she lied. It was her first lie to him, and it felt like a betrayal, even if it was for her own protection. She couldn't let him know she had spent the day dissecting his secrets. He nodded slowly, as if accepting the lie, though she had a feeling he could smell the dishonesty in the air. "Good. Tonight will be more difficult. The curse adapts, it will sense the piece of you it took, and it will try to widen the breach." Before she could respond, the now familiar shudder racked his frame. It was more violent this time. He gritted his teeth, a low growl escaping his throat. He didn't rise and stalk to the center of the room as he had before. He stayed on the throne, gripping the arms, as if he could somehow anchor himself against the storm that was breaking inside him. The black veins crawled up his neck again, darker and more pronounced. They pulsed with a malevolent light, tracing patterns across his skin. His breath hitched, turning into a ragged pant. He threw his head back against the throne, his eyes squeezed shut, his face a mask of agony. "Watch," he gasped out, the single word a command and a plea. "And be empty." Adena stood frozen, her heart aching with a fresh wave of the forbidden pity. It was so much worse now that she knew. He wasn't just fighting a curse, he was fighting himself, fighting his own history. The sorrow she had scented on him was the fuel for this fire. The curse wasn't an external parasite. It was feeding on the poison of his own grief. The curse's power surged. The flames in the great hearth leaped and twisted, casting demonic shadows that danced and writhed on the walls. The air grew thick and cold, crackling with a raw, chaotic energy. Darik's body arched in the throne, a silent scream locked behind his clenched teeth. His hands, gripping the obsidian, began to change. His nails thickened, darkening and elongating into vicious black claws that scraped and gouged the unyielding stone. Adena's own hand flew to her side, to the place where the cold void resided. It began to burn. Not with the sharp, searing pain of the first night, but with a deep, throbbing ache. The curse was calling to the piece of her it now owned, trying to use it as a bridge. Darik's eyes snapped open. The gold was gone, consumed entirely by a swirling vortex of pure blackness. The beast was in control. It looked at her, and its gaze was not one of simple hunger. It was intelligent, cunning. It knew her now. "He suffers," a voice whispered in her mind. It was not her own thought. It was slick and persuasive, like oil on water. You could ease his pain, a single moment of compassion. It would be a mercy. Adena recoiled. The voice was coming from the emptiness inside her, a tendril of the curse's consciousness that had taken root. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. The beast on the throne tilted its head, A slow, cruel smile spread across Darik's face, a terrible perversion of his features. The smile was chillingly familiar. It was the same cold, knowing smirk she had seen on her reflection in the mirror. He took the curse for his brother, the voice whispered again, offering up a sliver of truth as bait. He failed him, he watched him die. This pain is his penance. He welcomes it, but you could offer him a moment of peace, a gift, his brother. The word struck her like a physical blow. The sorrow she had scented on him suddenly had a name, a shape. She could almost see it. A scene of blood and failure, a promise broken. The urge to reach out, to offer a word of comfort, was a physical thing, a crushing pressure in her chest. The ache in her side intensified, twisting like a knife. "Be a stone," she muttered to herself, her nails digging into her palms. "Be a stone." The beast on the throne watched her internal struggle, its black eyes gleaming with malevolent satisfaction. It wasn't just feeding on Darik's pain, it was trying to farm her soul. It was using his suffering as a lure to catch her compassion. "He cannot bear it alone," the voice cooed, growing stronger, more insistent. "Look at him, the vessel is cracking. Give him your strength. Share his burden." Darik's body began to tremble violently. The claws on his hands dug deeper into the throne, sending splinters of obsidian skittering across the dais. A low, keening sound of pure agony escaped his lips, a sound that bypassed the ears and went straight to the heart. It was the sound of a soul being torn apart. Adina cried out, a small, involuntary sound of distress. The moment she did, the ache in her side exploded into a blinding flash of white-hot pain. It felt as if a hook had been plunged into her, tearing something loose. She screamed, stumbling back, clutching her side as the world tilted and swam before her eyes. Through a haze of pain, she saw the beast on the throne roar in triumph. The black energy around Darik surged, and for a terrifying second, she saw his form flicker, elongating, becoming something hunched and monstrous, more wolf than man. No, the word was not spoken. It was a silent, desperate roar from the man trapped inside the beast. Darik's own will, his own soul, fought back from the abyss. The monstrous shape receded. He threw himself from the throne, crashing to the stone floor with a sickening thud. He landed on his hands and knees, his head hanging, his body convulsing. He was fighting it. For her. He was fighting to protect her from the consequences of her own weakness. The realization cut through her pain. He was suffering this agony to keep the beast from fully taking her, from using her to break free. He was her shield, even as he was her tormentor. The stone facade she had tried so desperately to maintain shattered into 1,000 pieces. It wasn't pity she felt now. It was something far more potent, far more dangerous. It was admiration, respect, a fierce, desperate connection to the man who was fighting a war on two fronts, against the curse within him, and for the soul of the woman who was supposed to be his sacrifice. The voice in her head screamed in frustration as its connection was weakened by Darik's resistance. The pain in her side subsided again to that familiar, hollow cold, but she knew the void had grown. She had lost another piece of herself. Darik collapsed onto the floor, the transformation receding completely. He lay on the cold stone, gasping for air, the black veins slowly retreating from his skin. He was utterly spent, his body trembling with the aftershocks of the battle. Adina took a shaky step forward, and then another. She walked until she stood at the foot of the dais, looking down at the broken form of the king. He was no longer a terrifying monarch or a monstrous beast. He was just a man, stripped bare of all his defenses, lying exhausted on the floor of his empty hall. He slowly, painfully pushed himself up onto one elbow. He lifted his head, and his molten gold eyes, clouded with pain and exhaustion, found hers. She expected to see anger, condemnation for her failure. Instead, she saw a flicker of raw, unguarded gratitude. "You held," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "At the end, you held." She hadn't held, she had broken. He had been the one to hold. He had saved them both. But he was giving the victory to her. He was trying to repair the crack in her resolve, trying to rebuild the stone he so desperately needed her to be. Without thinking, without weighing the consequences, she knelt down on the cold floor, just a few feet from him. It was not an act of submission, it was an act of solidarity, an acknowledgement of a shared battle. She looked at the man who had traded his soul for his brother's, And she made a new promise, a silent one to herself. She would not let him fight this war alone. Being a stone would not save them. She had to find a way to be a shield. Her act of kneeling sent a tremor through him. Darek flinched, not with pain, but with a sharp, profound shock, as if she had laid a burning hand upon his skin. His golden eyes widened, the exhaustion within them momentarily eclipsed by a raw, startled vulnerability. He had expected her to retreat in fear or stand in judgment. He had not expected this quiet solidarity, this nearness. "Get up," he rasped, his voice rough with the dregs of the curse's power. It was an order, but it lacked its usual force. It was the plea of a man who had built his fortress on a foundation of isolation and now felt the first crack appear in its walls. Adina did not move. She remained on her knees on the cold flagstones, her gaze steady. "You saved me," she said, her voice quiet but clear in the vast hall. "The beast had me. You pulled it back." He pushed himself into a sitting position, a feat that cost him a visible wave of effort. He leaned his back against the base of the dais, his long legs splayed out before him. He looked like a fallen giant, magnificent and broken. "I contained the breach. You gave it purchase? There is a difference." His words were harsh, a desperate attempt to re-establish the distance between them, to force her back into the role of the unfeeling witness. But she had seen the truth. She had scented the lie of his monstrousness and witnessed the heroism of his sacrifice. The walls were down, and she would not help him rebuild them. "It told me about your brother." The name, unspoken, hung in the air between them like a ghost. The temperature in the hall, which had been returning to its normal chill, plunged again. A frost of pure grief seemed to form on the air. Darek's face became a mask of stone, but it was the brittle stone of a statue on the verge of shattering. "The curse will use anything," he said, his voice flat and dead. "Any truth, any memory, it will turn your own heart into a weapon against you. You must give it nothing to use." "How can I give it nothing when I'm standing in the very heart of your pain?" she countered, her voice rising with a passion she couldn't suppress. "This castle, this silence, this curse. It is all him, isn't it? Every stone is a monument to your grief." He flinched as if she had struck him. He turned his head, staring into the roaring fire, refusing to look at her. His profile was stark and beautiful in the flickering light, the line of his jaw tight with a sorrow so immense it seemed to suck the very air from the room. "You know nothing," he bit out, the words clipped and sharp. "I know the scent of a lie," she whispered. "And I know the sound of a man who is screaming on the inside." The silence that followed was absolute. The fire crackled. Her own heart hammered against her ribs. She had crossed a line, pushing past the boundaries of their contract, into the raw, unguarded territory of his soul. He could have her thrown in a dungeon. He could kill her. He was the king, but he did nothing. He simply sat there, his defenses crumbling, exposed under the gentle, relentless pressure of her gaze. Finally he spoke, his voice so low it was almost carried away by the fire's roar. His name was Liam. He said the name as if it were a fragile, priceless thing he had kept locked away for centuries. "He was my younger brother, my beta. He was the sun. And I was his shadow." Adina listened, her breath held tight in her chest. She didn't prompt him, didn't speak. She simply became a vessel for his story, offering him the silent, accepting space he had clearly been denied for an eternity. "There was a plague," he continued, his eyes still fixed on the flames, but seeing something else entirely. "A sickness of the blood that targeted our kind. It moved like wildfire through the northern packs. Our father, the king, was old. He forbade anyone from seeking outside help, trusting in our own strength. It was pride, arrogance, and it was a death sentence." His hand clenched into a fist on his thigh. Liam caught it. He was strong, but the fever, it burned away his wolf. It left him human, weak, dying in a world of predators. He fell silent, the memory too heavy. Adina could feel the weight of it, the crushing guilt. "I was the alpha heir. I was supposed to be the strong one, the wise one, but I defied my father. I went seeking a cure. I traveled to the sunless mire, to the old places where the ancient magic still sleeps. I found a being, an entity. It offered me a deal." His voice dropped to a barely audible whisper, thick with self-loathing. A life for a life. A soul for a soul. I thought it meant my own. I thought I was making a noble sacrifice. I would give up my life, my soul, to save him. He finally turned his head, and his molten gold eyes, swimming with an agony that transcended time, locked onto hers. I made a promise. I accepted the contract. The magic flowed from me, a conduit of power that traveled back to the castle. I felt it connect with him. I felt the fever break. I felt his wolf stir returning to him. I had done it. I had saved him. A single crystalline tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek, gleaming like liquid gold in the firelight. But the price, it was not my life. It was his. The magic required an alpha soul to power the cure for a beta. The entity had twisted my words. It took my soul, hollowed me out, and poured its own darkness, this curse, into the void. And in that same moment, back in the castle, Liam's heart stopped. The life I poured into him was anchored to the soul I had just lost. When my soul died, his anchor was gone. My cure killed him instantly. The confession hung in the hall, a testament to a love so fierce it had broken the world. Adina felt her own heart break for him. For the young, desperate alpha, who had only wanted to save his brother and had instead become his executioner. For the king who had spent centuries punishing himself for a single terrible mistake. The curse took root, he murmured, his voice now hollow, devoid of all feeling. It fed on my grief, my guilt. It grew. I returned to the castle not a savior, but a monster, my father. He looked at me and saw what I had become. He died a week later, they said, of a broken heart. I inherited a throne, a kingdom, and an eternity of this agony. I am the king of a graveyard of my own making. Here it was, the source of the sorrow, the root of the curse. Not an ancient evil, but a tragic human mistake, amplified by magic into a world-ending catastrophe. It wasn't your fault, she whispered, the words feeling small and inadequate in the face of his monumental pain. I made the promise, he countered, his voice regaining a sliver of its old hardness. I chose. He fell silent again, the confession having drained him completely. He looked smaller now, diminished by the weight of his own history. The beast was gone. The king was gone. All that was left was Darek, a man flayed open, his oldest wound exposed to the air. Slowly, carefully, Adina shifted, moving from her kneeling position to sit on the floor, tucking her legs beneath her. She was still several feet away, but the change in posture was a deliberate act of settling in, of showing him she wasn't going anywhere. She was no longer just a witness to his curse. She was a witness to his soul. They sat in silence for a long time. The fire burned down to glowing embers. The shadows in the hall deepened. Darek didn't move. He seemed lost in the past, adrift in a sea of regret. Adina simply watched him, her presence a quiet, steady anchor in a storm. She offered no more words, no more comfort. She just was. A stillness in his chaos. Eventually, his breathing evened out. The rigid tension in his shoulders eased. He looked calmer, as if the act of speaking the truth aloud for the first time in centuries had lanced a poisoned wound. He turned his head and looked at her. The raw agony in his eyes had been replaced by a profound, soul-deep weariness. But there was something else there too, a flicker of light in the darkness. "Why?" he asked, his voice a soft rasp. "Why are you still here? Why did you not run screaming from this hall?" "Where would I go?" she answered simply. "My promise holds me here just as tightly as yours holds you." She paused, then added, "And I don't see a monster anymore." His breath hitched. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a component of a contract, not as a vessel for a soul, but as Adina, a woman. And in his gaze she saw the beast surrender, not to the curse, but to the first glimmer of hope it had seen in an age. He slowly, deliberately held out his hand. It was a large hand, calloused and scarred, the nails still a little too long, a little too sharp, a faint reminder of the claws they had been. It was not a command. It was not a gesture of aggression. It was an invitation, an offering, a question. Adina's heart stopped. To take his hand would be to cement this fragile, impossible connection between them. It would be an act of utter madness, a complete betrayal of the role she was supposed to play. To be a stone was to be safe. To take his hand was to step willingly into the heart of the fire. Her own hand, small and pale in the dim light, trembled as she lifted it. She reached across the space that separated them, her fingers brushing against his. His skin was rough, but beneath it, a current of that incredible furnace-like heat pulsed. It was the heat of life. She laid her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, engulfing her hand in his. His grip was surprisingly gentle, a careful, reverent touch, as if he were holding a sleeping bird. And as their skin met, something shifted deep inside her, the cold, hollow void where the curse had taken its pieces of her. It didn't disappear, but for the first time she felt a flicker of warmth brush against its icy edges. It was his warmth, his life, his soul reaching out to touch what was left of hers. The warmth from his hand was a living thing. It seeped into her skin, a current of pure, untainted life that spread up her arm and settled deep in her chest. It was a shocking contrast to the encroaching cold of the void inside her. For a long, silent moment, they simply stayed like that, kneeling on the floor of the cavernous throne room, connected by a single, fragile touch. The great hall, once a place of terror and intimidation, felt intimate, sacred, a confessional where a king had laid his soul bare. Darik's gaze was fixed on their joined hands, his expression one of awed disbelief. He seemed to be studying the way her smaller, paler fingers rested in his scarred palm, as if he had never seen such a thing before. Perhaps he hadn't. Perhaps this was the first willing, gentle touch he had known in centuries. The thought sent a pang of sorrow through her, so sharp and swift that she almost mistook it for the curse's bite. But this was her own feeling, an emotion born not of pity, but of a deep, burgeoning affection that terrified her more than any monster. He finally lifted his gaze to meet hers. The weariness was still there, but the raw agony had receded, replaced by a question. His golden eyes, no longer burning with cursed energy or kingly authority, were soft, searching. He was asking for something she couldn't name, something she wasn't sure she had the right to give. Slowly, reluctantly, he released her hand. The loss of his warmth was immediate and profound, leaving her skin feeling cold and strangely empty. He used the dais to push himself to his feet, his movements still stiff with exhaustion, but no longer broken. He stood over her, a mountain of a man, cloaked in shadow and sorrow. "It is almost dawn," he said, his voice a low rumble that held none of its earlier harshness. "You should rest." He offered her his hand again, this time to help her up. She took it without hesitation. His strength was effortless as he pulled her to her feet, his grip firm and steadying. He let go the moment she was stable, stepping back to create a respectful distance. Yet the space between them felt charged, alive with unspoken things. "Darik," she said, speaking his name for the first time without a title. It felt right on her tongue. It felt true. "What happens on the seventh night, the final dawn?" His expression shuddered, the soft vulnerability vanishing behind the familiar mask of the stoic king. "The contract is fulfilled. The magic that sustains your mother's life will become permanent, severed from its connection to this place. And your soul will be taken to pay the price. It will become the final lock on the curse's cage." "It will destroy you, Hald," she stated, a cold certainty gripping her. If her whole soul was used as the lock, it would mean he would be bound to the curse for eternity, with no hope of reprieve. He would be the permanent jailer of his own demon, fueled by the essence of the one person who had seen past his monstrous facade. It was a fate worse than death. "My fate was sealed the day my brother died," he said, his voice flat. "This contract was never about saving me. It was about containing the monster I created. There has to be another way." The words were out before she could stop them. They were words of hope, a dangerous and forbidden currency in this fortress of despair. A sad, bitter smile touched his lips. "I have had centuries to look for another way, Adina. I have scoured every book in that library, journeyed to the ends of the earth in my mind. There is none. The price of magic must always be paid. A life for a life, a soul for a soul." He turned away from her. "Go. Elspeth will show you to your room." As if summoned, the old woman materialized from the shadows near the great doors. Her face was as impassive as ever, but her dark eyes darted between Adina and the king, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. Adina didn't want to leave him. She wanted to stay, to argue, to fight the grim finality in his voice. But she saw the wall he had erected, the way his shoulders were set in a posture of dismissal. He had shared his wound, but now he was protecting it again. Pushing him further would only cause him more pain. With a reluctant nod, she turned and followed Elspeth from the throne room. The journey back to her chambers was different this time. The castle no longer felt dead, merely sleeping. She saw the slash marks on the portraits not as vandalism, but as the desperate rage of a grieving man trying to erase the faces of those he had failed. She felt the silence not as an oppressive emptiness, but as a heavy blanket of sorrow. The entire fortress was a reflection of his heart, and now that she had been allowed inside, she could read its language of pain. Back in her room, sleep was impossible. Her mind replayed their conversation, the feel of his hand, the sound of his brother's name on his lips. She walked to the mirror, no longer afraid of what she might see. Her reflection stared back, pale in the pre-dawn light. She searched her own eyes, and for a moment, she saw it again, the faint, icy gray film. The whisper of the curse was still inside her, a tenant in the hollowed-out spaces of her soul. But it seemed weaker now, less menacing. It was as if Darik's confession, his act of sharing his burden, had starved it somehow. The curse fed on his grief and guilt, and it fed on her fear and pity. But what would it do with hope? What would it do with love? The thought bloomed in her chest, a terrifying, beautiful flower. Was this what she was feeling? This fierce, protective connection to a broken king? It was madness. It was suicide. And it was the truest thing she had ever felt. 3 more nights passed in a strange suspended peace. Each evening she would go to the throne room. He would be waiting. The curse would rise, a writhing storm of black energy and agonizing pain. But something had changed. Adina was no longer a passive witness trying to be a stone. She had found a new strategy. She would not feel pity. Pity was for a victim, and Darik was a warrior. Instead, she focused on the man, on the strength it took for him to endure this nightly crucifixion. She met the beast's gaze not with fear, but with a calm, unwavering defiance. She became an anchor for the man, not the curse. She would think of his hand in hers, of the story of his brother, of the brave, foolish boy who had tried to defy death for love. And it worked. The voice in her head was still there, a venomous whisper from the void, but its words had less power. He is weak, it would hiss. He deserves this pain. He is strong, Adina would think back, a silent rebuttal. He is paying a debt he believes he owes. The curse would rage, and Darik would still suffer, his body still twisting in agony. But the beast no longer seemed to get the same purchase. The transformations were less severe. The black fire in his eyes would be met with her steady gaze, and a flicker of the man's gold would always remain, a besieged but unconquered fortress. Each night, the pain she felt in her side lessened. The curse still tugged at the pieces it owned, but it could not seem to take more. She was holding the line. They were holding it together. After the trial was over, he would collapse, exhausted, and she would come and sit on the floor a few feet away. They would talk, not of the curse or the contract or the looming final dawn. He would ask about her village, about her mother's garden, about the taste of sun-warmed strawberries. She would ask him about the stars, which he had studied for centuries, and he would describe constellations she had never seen, naming them with the familiarity of old friends. He told her his brother Liam had loved to paint, and that the slash marks on the canvases in the gallery were his own, done in a fit of rage and grief in the first years after his death. A deed he regretted more than almost any other. He told her Elspeth and the 2 guards were all that remained of his father's court, bound to the castle by ancient oaths, their aging slowed by its magic, silent witnesses to his long penance. In these quiet hours, she saw the king he could have been, wise, gentle, with a dry, weary wit, and a soul that yearned for the sun, and she fell deeper in love with him, a hopeless, desperate love that grew in the shadow of their impending doom. On the morning before the 6th night, Elspeth came with her usual tray and a message. "The king requests your presence in the solarium." Adina had never heard of a solarium. She followed the old woman through a part of the castle she'd never seen, down a corridor lined with dusty, shrouded statues. They came to a set of tall, glass-paned doors. Elspeth opened them and stepped aside. Adina walked through and gasped. It was a vast circular room, its walls and ceiling made almost entirely of glass. After days spent in the gloom of the stone fortress, the sudden flood of bright, clear sunlight was almost blinding. In the center of the room, a massive, long-dead tree stood, its gnarled, leafless branches reaching up like skeletal fingers toward the glass dome. But all around it, life flourished. Planters and pots overflowed with green, vibrant plants, ferns and ivy and strange, beautiful flowers, in shades of deep purple and blood red that seemed to drink the light. The air was warm and humid, thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming blossoms. Darek stood by the central tree, his back to her, one hand resting on its petrified bark. He turned as she entered. The sunlight caught in his dark hair, weaving threads of silver and gold into the black. It softened the harsh lines of his face, making him look younger, less burdened. "My mother was a botanist," he said, his voice quiet. "She built this place, a pocket of life in a world of stone. It's the only part of the castle the curse cannot touch. The life here. It is anathema to it." Adina walked further into the room, her fingers trailing over a velvety crimson petal. "It's beautiful. After she died and after Liam, I let it all wither," he said, his gaze distant. It took Elspeth decades to bring it back, a single pot at a time, a quiet act of defiance. He looked at her then, his golden eyes serious. "Tonight is the 6th night. It will be the most difficult yet. The curse knows its time is running out. It will throw all its strength against the walls of its cage, against me, and against you." A knot of dread tightened in her stomach. "We will face it, together." "Adina," he said, and the way he spoke her name was a caress and a warning. He took a step toward her, closing the distance between them. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently push back a stray lock of her hair that had fallen across her face. His fingers brushed her temple, a touch as light as a moth's wing, but it sent a jolt of lightning through her. "There is a scar," he murmured, his thumb tracing a line just above her eyebrow she hadn't even known was there. It was a tiny, silvery white mark from a childhood fall. "I fell from a tree when I was 7, she whispered, her breath catching in her throat. "I have a few of my own," he said, a wry, sad smile touching his lips. He took her hand and lifted it to his face, pressing her palm against the jagged, brutal scar that cut across his features. His skin was warm, rough with stubble. She could feel the solid bone of his cheek beneath her palm. It was the most intimate gesture she had ever known. "A manticore," he said softly. "During the Ogre Wars, I was young, arrogant. I thought I was immortal." He held her hand there, his golden eyes searching hers, filled with a desperate, unspoken emotion. "Every scar tells a story, Adina. A story of a wound that has healed. But some wounds, some sacrifices, they leave scars on the soul, and they never heal." She knew what he was saying. He was preparing her. He was showing her his own healed wound to give her strength. But he was also warning her that the wounds they now shared might never close. The 7th dawn was coming, and with it, a final sacrifice that would leave a scar so deep it would tear their two worlds apart forever. The 6th night was a war. The curse, sensing its impending containment, threw itself against Darek's soul with the fury of a cornered animal. It used every weapon in its arsenal. It dredged up the image of his brother's last breath, the sound of his father's weeping, the scent of the plague-ridden sickbeds. It projected them into the hall, phantoms of memory and pain designed to shatter his control. But Adina was his shield. She stood her ground, an immovable object against the curse's irresistible force. When the ghostly image of a young, dying Liam appeared, his face pale and feverish, she did not look at the phantom. She looked at Darek. She saw the man, not the memory. She met the agony in his golden eyes and projected her own strength, her own unwavering belief in him, across the space between them. The voice in her head was a cacophony of venomous lies. "He killed him," it shrieked. "His love is poison. His love was a sacrifice," Adina countered, her mind a fortress. He tried to save him. The curse turned on her, showing her visions of her own mother, her skin growing gray, the miracle of her healing reversing. It showed her the village elders signing the moon contract, their faces grim, condemning her to this fate. But the fear it tried to sow found no purchase. Her fate was already sealed. Her choice was already made. Together, they weathered the storm. It was the longest and most brutal of the trials, leaving Darek utterly broken on the floor, and Adina trembling with a psychic exhaustion so profound she could barely stand. But they had held. They had won. Only one night remained. The seventh day passed in a haze of quiet dread. They did not speak of the coming dawn. They sat together in the solarium, surrounded by the silent, living plants, and let the silence speak for them. Darek told her the names of the constellations that would be in the sky that night, his voice a low, comforting murmur. He spoke of the Crimson Archer and the Wolf Queen, telling her the ancient stories of gods and heroes, a litany of forgotten myths. It was his way of saying goodbye. As dusk fell, casting long, sad shadows through the glass walls, he finally looked at her, his face etched with a pain that had nothing to do with the curse. "I cannot ask you to come to the throne room tonight," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "When the dawn comes, the contract will complete itself, no matter where you are in this castle. I will not have your last moments be of you watching me in agony." "There is nowhere else I would rather be," she answered, her voice trembling but firm. "My promise was for 7 nights. I will not break it on the last." His control finally fractured. He reached for her, pulling her from her chair and into his arms, crushing her against his chest. His embrace was not gentle. It was a desperate, frantic act of a drowning man clinging to his only piece of driftwood. He buried his face in her hair, and she felt a shudder rack his entire body. It was not the curse. It was a sob, silent and soul-shattering. "I am sorry, Adina," he whispered, his voice broken. "I am so sorry for this, for all of it." "Shh," she murmured, her arms wrapping around his massive torso, holding him as tightly as she could. "You gave my mother back to me. No price is too high for that." Even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. The price was him, and it felt impossibly high. They walked to the throne room together, hand in hand. The 2 silent guards stood by the doors, and as they passed, one of them, for the first time, inclined his head in a gesture of profound respect. He was not looking at his king. He was looking at her. The final trial began not with a roar, but with a whisper. As the last vestiges of twilight faded, the moon contract, the physical scroll she had signed in her village, materialized in the air between them. It hovered, glowing with a soft silver light, the dark, blood-signed ink of their names pulsing like a living heart. "It is time," Darek said, his voice grim. He released her hand and walked to the center of the room, standing directly beneath the floating scroll. He looked at her, and his golden eyes were filled with 1,000 unspoken goodbyes. "Stay back, Adina, please." She stayed where she was, near the doors, her heart a block of ice in her chest. The curse did not rise in a wave of agony. Instead, the silver light from the contract intensified, casting a beam down upon Darek. He didn't scream or convulse. He simply stood, his head thrown back, as the light seemed to pour into him. Black, inky tendrils of energy, the very essence of the curse, began to rise from his skin. They were not raging, they were being drawn out, pulled from him like poison from a wound, flowing upward into the glowing contract. The magic was working, it was containing the curse, but the price had to be paid. From her own chest, Adina felt a pull. It was not painful, it was a gentle, inexorable summons. A silver thread of light, shimmering and ethereal, emerged from her heart and drifted through the air, connecting with the scroll. It was her soul. It was being drawn out, a willing payment to complete the ritual. She watched, mesmerized, as the black tendrils of the curse were slowly encapsulated by the silver light of her soul within the scroll. The lock was being forged. The cage was being sealed. But something was wrong. Darek cried out, a sharp gasp of pain. The black tendrils stopped flowing from him. Instead, the silver light of her soul, now within the scroll, began to flow downward, pouring into him along with the curse's contained energy. "No," he choked out, falling to one knee. It's not just taking your soul, it's giving it to me." Adina stared in horror. The ancient magic, twisted by the entity in the mire, was not just using her soul as a lock. It was performing a literal exchange. It was pouring her pure, untainted soul into the void within him. The void left by the loss of his own. And in return, the curse, contained but not destroyed, was being forced into her. She was not to be the lock on the cage. She was to be the new cage. "Darek," she screamed, running forward. "Stay back," he roared, a command born of pure panic. "Adina, don't." She saw the truth in a flash of terrible understanding. The contract was a life for a life, a soul for a soul. To save her mother, Adina's soul was forfeit. But for Darek to be whole, for his soul to be restored, another vessel had to be found for the curse he carried. The contract was not just about payment. It was about balance. He would be free. He would be human again, his own soul replaced by hers. And she would become him. She would inherit the fortress, the solitude, and the eternity of torment. The first rays of dawn pierced the high windows of the throne room, a sliver of pale gold light that cut through the gloom. The final dawn. The moment the contract would be irrevocably sealed. The flow of energy intensified. Adina could feel the void inside her. The two small holes left by the curse begin to ache with a terrible, familiar hunger. The black energy now being forced into her was drawn to them, beginning to take root. She saw Darek's face, and the lines of pain were easing, the golden glow in his eyes brightening, becoming clearer. His skin, unnaturally pale for centuries, was gaining a faint human flush. He was being healed. He was being saved. And she was being damned. He looked at her, his eyes wide with horror and a dawning unbearable joy, as he felt his own soul being reborn from the fabric of hers. He saw her face begin to pale, saw a black vein flicker at her temple, and he made his choice. With a roar that was not of a beast, but of a man choosing his own destiny, he fought the magic. He shoved his own will against the flow, trying to reject the gift of her soul. "I will not let you do this," he bellowed at the glowing scroll, at the ancient, indifferent magic. But the contract was absolute. The flow continued. He was being filled with her light, and she was being filled with his darkness. She looked at him, at the man she loved, who was being given a second chance at life. And she looked at the dawn, the beautiful, cruel dawn that was meant to be her end. But she saw a different ending, a different choice. "A promise," he had told her, his voice raw with pain on that first night, "is always a choice." She had promised her soul to save her mother, but she had made another silent promise. She had promised to be his shield. "The price of magic must always be paid," she whispered, his own words echoing back to her. She ran, not away from him, but toward him. She closed the distance between them in 3 desperate strides, just as the sun's rays grew stronger, bathing the dais in golden light. She threw her arms around him, pressing her body against his. "Adina, no," he cried, his voice breaking with anguish. "A soul for a soul," she whispered against his chest, her heart breaking and soaring all at once. "But it must be a willing sacrifice." And with the last of her strength, with every ounce of her will, she did the one thing the curse could not abide. She poured her love for him, pure and unconditional, into the connection. She accepted the darkness. She welcomed it. She chose not to be its cage, but to be its end. She would not contain it. She would smother it with the very light it could not touch. The glowing scroll above them flared with an impossible brilliance. The flow of energy reversed and then exploded. Silver and black light erupted through the hall in a silent, violent shockwave. It was the sound of a contract being broken. It was the sound of a price being refused. It was the sound of a promise being kept, not by law, but by love. The light consumed them, and Adina knew no more. Warmth. That was the first thing she knew. A gentle, pervasive warmth that seemed to soak right through her skin and into her bones. It was the warmth of sunlight through a window, of clean linen, of a body resting in profound peace. There was no cold. The hollow voids in her soul, the small, hungry mouths of the curse that had taken root inside her, were gone. She was not empty. She felt full, brimming with a quiet, steady light that was entirely her own. Adina's eyes fluttered open. She was not in the throne room. She was in her chamber, lying in the massive 4-poster bed, tangled in soft velvet blankets. Sunlight streamed through the high window, illuminating a room that was subtly changed. A vase of deep red blossoms, the kind she had seen in the solarium, sat on the bedside table. Their faint, sweet scent mingled with the clean smell of mountain air pouring through the slightly ajar window. For the first time, She could hear the sound of birdsong from outside the castle walls. She sat up, her heart pounding a slow, steady rhythm. She pressed a hand to her chest, then to her side. There was no ache, no phantom pressure, only the feeling of her own uninterrupted self. She looked at her hands, turning them over in the sunlight. They were her hands. She felt like herself, yet more so. The pieces she had lost had been returned, the cracks sealed not with scar tissue, but with something that felt like gold. Her gaze fell upon the ornate mirror in the corner. It stood gleaming, no longer a source of terror, but simply an object of silver and glass. With a deep breath, she slipped out of bed and walked toward it. Her reflection met her gaze. It was her own face, but the fear was gone from her eyes. The shadows of exhaustion were gone. A healthy color blushed her cheeks. She looked rested. She looked whole. She leaned closer, searching the green depths of her reflected eyes. There was no gray film, no hint of a cruel smirk waiting in the wings. There was only her, and deep within, a tiny warm flicker of gold, like a single mote of sunlight trapped in sea glass. A memory surfaced, a chaotic flash of silver and black light, of a love so fierce it had screamed defiance at the laws of magic. She remembered accepting the darkness, and in doing so, annihilating it. She had not broken the contract. She had fulfilled it in a way its ancient creators had never intended. Not a soul for a soul, but love for grief. Darek. His name was a prayer in her mind. A desperate, hopeful question. She turned from the mirror and hurried to the door. It was unlocked. She stepped into the hall, which was no longer oppressive and shadowed, but filled with the same clean light as her room. The air was fresh, and the eternal weeping chill of the stone was gone. The castle felt awake. She didn't know where she was going, but her feet carried her with an unerring certainty, down the winding stairs, through the now welcoming archways, toward the heart of the fortress. She pushed open the great doors to the throne room and stopped on the threshold. The cavernous hall was transformed. Sunlight poured from the high windows, bathing the black stone in a warm golden glow. The great hearth was swept clean, its fire extinguished. The obsidian throne still sat upon its dais, but it no longer looked like a seat of monstrous power. It was just a chair, a relic of a bygone sorrow. He was standing in the center of the room, in the exact spot where the contract had dissolved into light. He was staring up at the windows, his hands tucked into the pockets of his simple trousers. He was still, but it was the stillness of peace, not the coiled tension of a predator. "Darek," she whispered. He turned. The change in him stole her breath. The curse was gone. It was not just an observation, it was a palpable absence. The oppressive, crackling aura of power that had always surrounded him had vanished, replaced by a quiet, profound strength. The harsh angles of his face seemed to have softened. The sun-darkened skin of his face held a healthy, living tone. The jagged scar was still there, a pale white line that told a story of his past. But it was no longer a mark of damnation. It was simply a part of him. But it was his eyes that held her. The molten gold, the color of the beast, and the curse was gone. His eyes were now the color of warm, clear honey, flecked with green and brown. They were the eyes of a mortal man, and they were filled with a reverence and an adoration that made her knees weak. "Adina," he said, and his voice was different. The gravelly, grinding undertone was gone. It was a deep, smooth baritone, rich with an emotion he no longer had to hide. She walked toward him, her steps slow and uncertain. "You're whole," he finished for her, a small, wondrous smile touching his lips. It was the first true smile she had ever seen from him, and it transformed his face, chasing away the last of the shadows. "The magic. It didn't know what to do with your choice. A sacrifice of love isn't a transaction. It doesn't create a debt. It creates a miracle." He slowly closed the distance between them until he stood before her. He smelled of pine and clean air and sunlight. The primal scent of the beast was gone, leaving only the scent of the man. When you accepted the curse, you smothered it with a force it couldn't comprehend. It was unmade. The contract was nullified, but the magic still required balance. It couldn't take your soul because your sacrifice had purified the debt. So it took the void inside me, the hole where my own soul had been, and it filled it. It reawakened what was left of me, and it healed you with the overflow. He gently touched her cheek. his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. His hand was warm, simply warm, no longer a furnace of cursed power. There is a piece of you in me now, Adina, a flicker of your light, and I think there is a piece of me in you. She saw it then, in his honey-colored eyes, the faint glimmer of green, the color of her own, and she understood the flicker of gold she had seen in her reflection. They had not exchanged souls, they had shared them. They had healed each other. My mother, she breathed, the thought suddenly striking her. The contract is broken. The magic that healed her is now a willing gift, freely given from me to you, and through you to her, he said, his eyes soft. It is no longer bound by any price. It is permanent. I sent word with the dawn. She is safe. She is healed. Forever. Tears of relief and joy welled in her eyes. It was over, all of it. The debt, the curse, the fear. All that was left was this man, this impossible, beautiful man, looking at her as if she were the sunrise. He took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. My father named me Darek, which in the old tongue means to hold fast. For centuries, I thought it meant I was meant to hold fast to my grief, to my guilt. But now I think I was just waiting for something worth holding on to. He led her from the throne room, their footsteps echoing in a comfortable, companionable rhythm. He led her back to the solarium. The doors were wide open, and the warm, floral-scented air spilled out into the corridor. Inside, the light was brilliant. The plants seemed to have grown, their colors more vibrant, their leaves greener. The old, dead tree in the center of the room had a single, impossible green leaf sprouting from one of its petrified branches. Life was returning to the Blood Moon Court. They stood together in the center of the room, bathed in sunlight, their hands still intertwined. The ghosts of the past were gone, replaced by the promise of a future. The scars remained, on his face and in their memories, but they were no longer wounds. They were the story of how they had found each other in the dark. What will you do now? She asked softly. He turned to her, his mortal eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled. For the first time in a very long life, I have no idea. The world is new, but I know I do not wish to face it alone. He lifted her hand and pressed a gentle, reverent kiss to her knuckles. Adina R'Lin, you signed a contract for 7 nights in the Alpha King's service, but I would ask for a lifetime with the woman who saved my soul. Her heart soared. This was the promise she had been born to keep, not one of sacrifice and endings, but one of beginnings and hope. My promise was always to you, she said, her voice full of a certainty that resonated through her entire being. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not one of desperate, frantic passion, but of deep, quiet reverence. It was a kiss of homecoming, of 2 fractured souls made whole, of a final dawn that had broken not into an ending, but into the first day of the rest of their lives. The moon contract was paid, not with a soul, but with a love that had rewritten the stars.